So for today's class, we're going to look at this, which is the beginnings of the organized state or polity in North China around about 2000 BC. Now, the case example we'll be looking at today is North China, right? But some of the thematic issues that we'll be thinking about, things like social organization, economic exploitation, even the development of what we call an organized state, all of those things ought to be themes that we are thinking about as we look at examples like Japan or Korea in our readings, okay? Japan, Korea, and China did not develop along the same sort of, developmental trajectory at the same time, all right? So China was pretty much, I think, ahead of the game in the East Asian sphere in these sort of developments, especially the development of organized society and polity, and how did you then therefore structure society in order to sort of maximize economic output and so on and so forth, and social control, okay? Japan and Korea entered into that phase at a much later state, probably at the end of the first millennium BC and into the first millennium AD. So about almost 1,500 years later than the Chinese example. Okay, so that's part of the reason why we don't really see them. I try very hard not to put them together because in some ways, chronologically, it doesn't make sense if we try to do that. But thematically, we can extrapolate some of those and then just bear those things in mind as we do the readings. In particular, your textbooks, especially the one on Japan, does talk a little bit about the early formation of Japanese society after the Jomon era, which was what we saw on the class, the video last week. So from about 300 BC onwards, Japanese society began to sort of have some semblance of organized agriculture, and then therefore developments of organized societies at a much more complex level than what was evident at least at the Jomon period, okay, which was before 300 BC. But that's a little too far ahead, I think, in terms of time from what we're looking at here today. Okay, so we'll kind of focus on China today, just so that we have a coherent sort of case study that we can just look at. So one of the things that we were thinking about until about last week, was really sort of the prehistoric era. We ended at the end of the Neolithic period where we saw agriculture being developed, yeah? Certain kinds of arts and crafts, for example, like jade carving, ceramics, also the development of organized religion, right? So religion, ritual, the place of ritual, and how that sort of affected the way burials occurred, the way that a spatial landscape like the village, for example, would look like, and so on and so forth. So much so that by the second millennium BC, what we would see, at least in the case of China, was a couple of interesting things. One of which was technology. The emergence of the use of bronze by about the second millennium BC is a very important development in East Asia, but particularly in China during this period of time, right? It doesn't show up in Japan and Korea for another 2,000 years, okay? So China is pretty much ahead of the game. But the key here is to understand that the ability to manipulate fire, which was something that already was happening from about 5,000 BC onwards through the creation of ceramics like pottery and earthenware, right, is further enhanced. Okay, so it's one thing to fire earthenware, as we see in the Chinese context, in about 5,000 BC, which requires only about 900 degrees Celsius as a cooking temperature so that you can create earthenware. For bronze, you will require something along the lines of about 1,100 degrees Celsius. Okay, not Fahrenheit, Celsius, all right? So go do your conversion yourself, okay? About 1,100 Celsius, which is very, very high, right? And not only do you need to attain the temperature, you also need to keep it at that temperature for a substantial period of time, okay? And obviously, in order to create bronze is a what? It's a metal alloy. Does anybody know what metals do you need to mix in order to create bronze? Mm-hmm.
Is it copper and tin?
So you can do copper and tin. You can also do what? Copper and? Think of metals that can be melted at a relatively low. Zinc as well. Yeah, that's right. So these three metals, right? Zinc, lead, and tin along with copper are the sort of, components that would create what we call bronze. Okay, copper in its own is very, very soft and malleable, so you can't really use it very well. But when you put zinc or tin or lead in there as part of the flux, it becomes a much harder alloy. Okay, so technologically, right, the level of knowledge has to be sufficiently high in order to be able to manipulate these metals in this way. So that's one. The other one, obviously, is something that we've seen before, but gone on an exponential scale by the second millennium BC, and that's the development of large-scale settlements and agriculture. Okay, along with that would be concepts of urban spatial development that we had already seen in the Neolithic period in terms of the village layout, but becomes all the more sort of, enhanced, right, at super scale. Okay. And then things like social hierarchy is further reinforced and developed. And then, of course, the emergence of writing by about 1600 BC. Writing in particular is critically important because writing is a means by which you articulate what is the most important, right, to those who are at the elite of a society. Okay, so once you get the development of writing, it just means that there is an attempt to record things for posterity, for subsequent generations. It's no longer based on oral traditions or just, memory, okay? You actually are trying to codify certain things, all right, and sort of encapsulate them in sort of, firm form, right? And writing becomes one of those sorts of things. So what we see roughly about at 2000 BC mark in Northeast Asia, but particularly in China, are some of these major developments that occur. So just as a map, thinking about some of the things that we've talked about, the Neolithic period, where the Neolithic cultures are sort of centered around river mouths and the courses of river. We talked about this last week because of the need for resources, and particularly in China for agricultural development and so on and so forth, okay? And what we find, here's just an image of a village layout that we talked about last week as well, thinking about things, for example, like cemeteries being located in particular locations, also housing that is of different sizes, the fact that you had paths, right? And also stables, which suggest animal husbandry, okay? By the time you get to the second millennium BC, one of the things that you will notice is that the same sort of, primary features of an urban settlement in the late Neolithic period continues to occur, but in a much more sort of macro scale, okay? So a city, for example, in North China known as Zhangzhou, dated from about 1600 BC. And what is interesting is that we'll see a couple of key characteristics that are here, one of which is obviously these cluster of things here. Now, does anybody know what these are? Anyone? Wild guess. What do you think they are?
It could be like shops or shopping districts.
Mm-hmm. It could be a commercial district. Yeah. Okay. What else? Someone saying it now? Trade. So trading centers maybe. Warehouses, possibility of storage spaces. What else? Any other possibilities? Do you think they could be residential spaces like homes, basically? They could be, although the scale suggests that this is really huge, right? So if they are residential complexes, these are really big ones, okay? And so the likelihood that if they were residential spaces or buildings, whoever inhabited them probably had to be fairly well-to-do, yeah, or social elite. Mm-hmm.
Then you also argue that if they are residents, it could be the working class and there's multiple families within one of those buildings. That's why they're larger.
So we could be looking at extended kinship relationships that are in this space, for example. Yep, that's a possibility. So each of these could represent a family unit that is extended, right? That's a possibility. Yeah. What else? Anyone else? Farm area. There is that possibility that it could be a farm area. Although if it would be the farm area, we will be looking at spaces outside here, right? Rather than within this core center here, okay? So chances are it will be outside of, let me see, outside of this wall. This is a wall, okay? And so if we're thinking of a farm area, it would probably be outside of the permanent feature of a wall, okay? So again, it looks like what the Neolithic village that we've seen last week, except at a much, much larger scale, right? Here's a further sort of zooming out of that same city. And there are a couple of features that I think I'd like us to look at this map and think about, right? So what are some of the major clusters of activities in terms of spatial usage? And there are quite a number of these legends at the bottom of the map here, for example, okay? So low-hanging fruit, what are some of the activities that we might be looking at here in this space? Mm-hmm.
We could be seeing specialization of workforces, since there's a pottery workshop and a bronze workshop, and then cemeteries, which we talked about last time, and some sort of like religious ideas, so there could be more of a emphasis on people who actually practice those religious things.
Okay, so specialization, but also at the same time thinking about reinforcements of activities, for example, over time, including things like religion. What else? What other sort of things could we sort of think about when we are looking at this? Religious sites, although I don't really see them on this map. So they may be located outside of the space of somewhere else, right? What else?
I'm looking at where it says palaces that are inside of the inner city walls. So obviously, like you had already mentioned, the more well-off people live there.
Yeah.
Residential areas.
So residential areas for the elite, right? Spaces, primarily here, where the social and political elite would be resident, okay? Which assumes, therefore, that everybody else who is not a social elite will be located where? Outside of there, yeah. So there is beginning that whole notion of what the dichotomy, right? Because we don't see that in the Neolithic village as well. You get the larger houses, the smaller houses, but they're still within what? The village wall. Here, the first wall, which is the inner wall, is basically a wall utilized to demarcate whether or not you are part of the political or social elite or not. If you're not, then you'll be outside. If you are, you will be within, right? So social differentiations, okay? All right, what else? Anything else? Anything else that we could think about? What about activities such as bronze foundries, for example, which are located in this area here and here, right? So technology or the application of technology for making certain things are evident, right, in this particular location. Does anybody know what this actually means? A bone workshop. What do you mean by bone workshop?
Is that where they like butchered animals and like took their bones to like make like oracle bones?
So you could be processing animal bones for certain reasons. Yep. And we'll talk about that with regards to religion and language in a while. What else? Anyone online? What do you think? Bone workshop. I think pottery workshop, pretty straightforward. But a bone workshop is an interesting feature in Chinese society, at least around about 2000 BC. Okay? So what we see actually is a really interesting thing, okay? And that is the creation or the development of a really, really large urban center by about the middle of the second millennium BC, at least in North China, right? The city of Zhangzhou, which really lasts about 200 to 300 years during this period of time, was extremely big, 25 square kilometers. And it had a couple of features, including perimeter walls, for example, buildings stem turf platforms, which are these ones here. These ones are all what they're referring to as the stem turf platforms. But they're really huge. They're about 100 meters square to about 2,000 meters square. And just to give you a sense in terms of the comparison, a full-size Olympic swimming pool is about 1,250 square meters, okay? So some of these are half the size of an Olympic swimming pool, and many of them are actually 1.5 times that size. So these are really huge, okay? The platforms are not very high. They're usually about maybe 3 or 4 feet high, but you know, they're completely constructed of rammed earth or stemmed earth, right? So lots and lots of people are pounding with wooden elements to sort of compress the earth down. And then you do it layer by layer by layer, and you create this platform that's about, you know, 3 or 4 feet high. Quite a substantial amount of effort in order to be able to do that. And also interesting special economic zones or activities, including things like bone factories, pottery workshops, bronze foundries, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, as a continuation of the Neolithic practice, you have burial sites outside of the larger or the second city wall, right? The bigger city wall around the city of Changzhou, okay? So features that are common in the Neolithic period, but sort of, you know, upscaled, as it were, into a really, really large macro scale by the second millennium BC, okay? So here's a picture of the what do you call that? The walls, the platforms, where archaeologists suspect that they are elite residences. So you have a number of palace buildings, and all of which are constructed of rammed earth. Note that they are in some kind of spatial order. That's the other thing. So this whole city didn't just develop out of, you know, like a small point of origin, right? So usually when we think about urban settlement patterns, if a city develops like this over time, that's an organic growth, okay? It starts small, and then as the need sort of, you know, emerges, you have these cities sort of growing out in this way, right? It's a sprawl, okay? When a city develops in this way, especially when it's like right angles, okay, and it's either a square or a rectangle, you know that this city actually is what? Planned, okay? The growth, in fact, is relatively minimal, all right? You immediately develop what is a square rectangle, and that is the city, okay? So it's an artificial construct based on whatever the requirements are of that particular society. Just a cross-section of the wall in this particular city, just to show you what the rammed earth process is. Notice that this has lots and lots of what? Layers, yeah? And so each of these layers require earth to be placed and then, you know, sort of stamped down by manpower. And then over time, creating what is effectively a wall or a rampart, right, constructed of earth, okay, that sort of forms the perimeter of this really, really large city that's from the second millennium BC. Yeah.
Have like sonar tests been done on these rammed earth constructions to see if like there are people buried inside of them?
Okay, so sonar cannot penetrate these rammed earth because they are so compressed that the X-ray or sound waves are not able to penetrate through the ground, okay? So one of the things that they've had to do is actually to cut a cross-section across the wall. And so this drawing actually is based on an excavation where they've actually cut a cross-section across the wall. So that's a good question, but yeah, it's good old archaeology with the state, basically, in order to be able to figure this one out because of how compact the earth is, yeah? We have a question or two comments there. One is a place where bones are used to make jewelry, bone reading, etc. Yep, very good. Yep, that's what they were used for. So a couple of macro regional spatial dynamics that we are seeing here by about 1400 BC, which is roughly sort of the tail end of this particular city in terms of its, you know, its period of activity, okay? Firstly, we see a hierarchy of cities and settlements across the landscape, all right? The macro landscape, which is roughly about 500 miles in diameter in North China, and you can see different sizes of cities and settlements sharing the same kind of cultural traits and cultural, sort of characteristics and urban settlement patterns, right, or settlements and so on and so forth in cities. The other thing that is really interesting is the distribution of primary resource extraction. So the first one obviously being agricultural products. Agricultural products is probably one of the most important economic basis, right, of this particular society in North China during this period of time. But along with that are two other things, one of which is salt. And this salt is not sea salt because we're looking at the central North Chinese plains, which is kind of very far away from the coastline. Does anybody know where the salt could possibly come from? Where would be some of the sources of the salt that we're thinking about in this economy of North China around about the middle of the second millennium BC? Do you know sources of salt?
Like mining.
You can mine salt, right? Yeah. So up in North China, there are quite a lot of salt mines that you actually have, okay, geologically. And so salt is extracted off the earth, kind of like your Himalayan salt, right? But except, obviously this is in North China. What else? Where else? Salt. Anyone? So the other way of extracting salt is through what we call brine pans, and it doesn't have to be at the sea. So basically evaporation of water, salty water, okay, in order to extract the salt mineral from it, okay? And in North China, you can actually do that too. Okay, it's extremely tedious. Okay, if you can imagine the amount of water that you have to channel into a salt pan, and the amount of effort you have to sort of kind of push the water back and forth, until all the water evaporates and you get the salt over a significant number of days and all. These are basically activities that require significant amount of human labor input. Okay, the third one is copper, right? And obviously because copper is rare. Copper is a useful metal, and then copper becomes a metal of social status and economic status as well. Okay, and so copper being the third sort of primary resource extraction that we see in this part of East Asia by the middle of the second millennium BC. And all of that is facilitated, at least at the broad regional scale, okay, by what we call a hydraulic system of communications. That's kind of just a sexy word for rivers and canals. Okay, so natural river systems, obviously, on this landscape, the Yellow River comes to mind, but there are a couple of secondary river systems as well that accompany that particular landscape. But along with that is the effort to connect some of these river systems with each other, right? So then you start building what? Canals, right? You start dredging canals in order to join these river systems up, okay? And you see that at a large scale. So if we think about this map, and it's really sort of very detailed, so I do apologize for that, but the heartland core of the Shang period or the second millennium BC in China is here, okay? But along with that, a whole bunch of river systems that we can see occurring, including a river system that runs this way, a whole bunch of rivers that are running along this way, right? There are a few smaller ones here. And then all of them are joined essentially to each other by the second millennium BC by a series of canals. So that what you have is a whole landscape that is a communication system, right? That's based on what? Water, okay? So barges and boats are developed during this time so that you can move large quantities of materials around the whole region. So much so that from a cultural point of view, by about 1500 BC, we are looking at a shared common cultural sphere that extends this huge geographical area, okay? The asynchronous exercise that we have for this week into next week, which is the virtual reality museum visit, right, in China, in Sichuan. The collection is primarily based on an excavation that was conducted in this area. They found a hoard with a huge amount of bronze, okay, bronze items there, right, from about 1400 BC. But then along with that, that's contemporaneous to all the bronzes that were discovered in all of these areas here, right? So what the museum exhibition is trying to do is show you the similarities and contrasts between these two regions, okay? And what is really amazing is that while the Sichuan Basin does have its own artistic and obviously like religious sort of iconographies that are quite different from that up in the north, the technology that they utilize is exactly the same, okay? So what is really interesting is there's some transference that we're looking at across this broad landscape, but it's fairly selective what those cultural and technological transferences are, right? Any questions at this point? Next to a river, yep. Mineral deposits typically around sedimentary deposits. Yep, that's a good comment. And this part of China is not as mountainous as this part of China, okay? So there is a difference, at least in terms of the topography. This is fairly flat. This part is the one that actually has all the hills and so on and so forth, okay, that we saw in terms of South Central China and the videos that we watched so far. I think about 2 weeks ago, we were thinking about geography, okay? Any other questions at this point?
Do we see like trade routes out of like that main area of the Sichuan, like down to the Sichuan Basin?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
Like, do we have an idea like how they would cross those rivers or
Right.
cross the mountains?
So they would navigate across the rivers where there are two rivers in this way, and then there's a, say like a hill, for example, a hill range. Then what you will have to do is put everything that you need to transport on human back and actually get human caravans to move it across the hill range to the next river system, okay? And so part of that obviously hampers the volume of exchange. So we don't see material exchange. We don't see pottery, for example, from North China going down to, from this area down to about here, here, right? We don't see the materials themselves being transferred. What we do find is the technology and the know-how, right? And to some extent, even the iconography to some extent, right, being transferred. So what that suggests is it's not the item necessarily that's moving. The people are the ones that are migrating. You see what I'm trying to say? Okay, so it's easier to migrate knowledge because all you need to do is have several groups of people with that knowledge, right, moving from area A to B, and you can actually begin to make sort of the same things in the new area, right? Whereas if you move the item, you are not necessarily moving the technological or cultural know-how, right? You're just moving the item itself, okay? And so over time in history, we look at trade. If you have the ease of large-scale transportation, usually it's the items that move in large scale. But the technology actually remains in the source of manufacture. It doesn't move at all. If it's very difficult to actually move large-scale items, like lots and lots of bowls, for example, right, from point A to point B, then what you have is technological transfer because it's easier to bring 5 people, right, from this area A to area B so that they can actually make these things because it's hard to transport these items, right? So this is what we're likely seeing here, okay? We may be looking at people moving as opposed to items basically being transferred across space, okay? But that's a very good question, all right? In terms of transfer. So here's another map, just simplified without all those things. And by the way, I will put all the all these slides on BB Learn at the end of class, okay? So just in case you need the maps, yeah.
Is this in like modern day Hebei?
Sorry?
Is this in like modern day Hebei?
This area? Yeah, it's the Hebei area. Yep. The Hebei and Henan. So if you think of the Yellow River, right? I mean, in Chinese, river is what? The word for river is?
I forgot.
Okay, so it's actually, the word is He, right? So Hebei means north, and Henan means south, right?
Yeah.
So when you say Hebei and Henan, you really are referring to the area that's sort of north and south, right, of the Yellow River, okay? Which is distinct from the Yangtze River area, and it's a river, so technically you should have been called what? He as well, right? But why don't they call it that? But instead they use the word Hu, which actually means a lake. And actually, historically, there was a massive lake area here in the middle of South Central China. And so they call that area Hubei and Hunan, which basically means north of the lake and what? South of the lake. That's basically how these terms for the provinces in China were developed. Okay. Yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks. Just as a question that, you know, sort of comes up. Yeah. So river systems and canals in particular, thinking about how you would join these two rivers together, for example, the Bai River and the Ru River, okay, together. And so you are basically looking at canal construction in these areas. Very strategic, all right? But what they do is they allow you to map the entire macro level region together, okay? Allowing therefore for the creation of a cultural sphere there. What is really interesting, of course, is that it does not remain static. So by about 1200 BC, which is roughly about, you know, 300 or 400 years down the road, right, from the formation or the establishment of the city of Zhangzhou, which was the big city that we were looking at just now. A number of interesting, significant differences begin to appear, okay? And so I put two maps side by side here, which I want you to just have a look at. And I'd like you to tell me what you think the differences are between these two maps, okay? So one map, which is this one here, right, dates from about 1600 BC, or rather the city was established in 1600 BC. And then this city was established in 1200 BC. What are the key differences that you can sort of identify between the two? Anyone? Okay.
The one on the right, they look like they're spreading out more.
This one, the city of Yin, looks like it's more spread out.
Spreading out more with larger grave
Yeah.
areas, but they're more condensed. So there may be more like communication between people. Even though they're more spread out, they may be more spread out because of agricultural sectors.
Yep. Okay, that's a possibility. So another thing that we might pick up here, at least in terms of the labeling, is that there now seems to be sacrificial pits when that didn't seem to be there in the other city from 1600 BC. Yeah, so that's a good one. So in terms of the spatial layout, we are looking at burial sites, religious sites being really far away, at least in the later city, compared to the earlier city where the religious sites and the burial sites seem to be very, very close still, right? Within sort of the urban core, close to the urban core, okay? So in some ways that may be intentional in the sense that if you are constructing an intentional cosmology of space, you would intentionally locate certain things very distinctly from somewhere else, right? Whereas I think the city of Yin was very much a development out of the Neolithic village. And so, yeah, it's much larger, but you know, this was how we kind of did it. So the proximity is still there, right? So the later city actually exhibited uses of space in a very, very different way. Okay, what else?
Did
you have something to say? Sorry. Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Yeah, go ahead, please. Yeah.
In the Yin City one, down the center, is that a river or a wall or a hill?
Yeah, so this is a river that goes through that particular landscape. Not necessarily the city, but the landscape, right? Whereas in this case, you actually have water courses that actually cut through, right, the urban settlement spaces themselves, okay? And that's actually a very interesting difference as well, all right?
Do they use the same materials as like they would in both cities, like for like houses or for even residential areas?
Yes, they did. So in terms of the natural resources like the earth, the wood, the timbers, and so on and so forth, the tiles with the roofing, they were exactly the same. And what we may be looking at is a difference in scale, okay? But otherwise, everything is the same in terms of the resources that were available. Good question. What else? Any other comments or any other differences? Someone said the bone factories seem to have disappeared. Yeah, to some extent. I think they were not on this map, which suggests what? That the activity of bone processing appears to have been what? Outsourced, right? To somewhere else, okay? So rather than urban centers that were self-contained in terms of, or self-sufficient in terms of the key things that they needed to produce, by 1200 BC, some of these urban centers, the really large ones, like the city of Yin, for example, appears to have outsourced certain activities to other urban centers, right? That would then bring the finished product to this particular urban center. By the way, the city of Yin was the capital, the political capital of the Shang dynasty of this period of time. Okay, so this is actually an absolutely important city. It was a political core center of this cultural sphere. And in terms of the space usage, the city of Changzhou is a lot more compressed, which suggests that even though there's social differentiation, as you indicated, we are possibly looking at a much more compressed, or sort of only a few layers of social hierarchical differentiations, right? Whereas in this city, it is very clear that what? The social hierarchical differentiation is much more amplified now, even on the physical space itself. Some of these features you can actually see even in modern day cities. If you look at a city map, towns that are sort of very, very nicely well clustered together, even though their social hierarchy, they tend to be relatively sort of, flat and compressed. Cities that clearly have that significant economic demarcation and, stratification, especially big cities, right? Like Chicago, for example, you can actually see that hierarchy being spaced out much more. And so that's what we're seeing in this particular city. The other thing that I think someone mentioned, which was very important, was the economic specialization that goes along with the social hierarchical differentiation as well. So much so that certain groups of people would be doing what? Bones, or at least in this case, things like pottery kilns, for example, bronze foundries, and certain others will be doing other things, including agriculture. So that actually is a very important thing. I would add one last one, and that is that the wall in this particular city actually is absolutely important, right? The fact that you have a really massive civil engineering project, which is basically the outer perimeter wall for this city, indicates that what, in terms of security, this particular city and the society that's located in this city is still not that safe, right? Whereas this map is pretty interesting because there are absolutely what? No walls, right? The only walls are here, which is used to demarcate basically the palace complex and everybody else, right? And so in this regard, this map here indicates that the issue of security or geopolitical stability is much more stable here than it was in this case. Yeah.
I was going to say it really shows the difference in political situations. Because also besides being security, it also, when things are so much closer together in like Guangzhou, it allows them to keep a better eye on their civilians and stuff. And then with in city like being different, being more spread out, it shows kind of the bigger strength and power of use of the Shang dynasty. Yeah. So.
Yeah. And in fact, the dynasty was probably a lot more secure in this period than in this period, right? Here, it is kind of apparent that competition between political elites of different families and different, lineages was more intense than the one in 1200 BC. Okay, yeah. In this period of time, not really. I think you don't really see the differentiation. So the question for those of you online is that do we see these cities being built with the defensive features to sort of be to prevent, right, ones from Central Asia, like the nomadic tribes, from making incursions into these places in North China? And my answer was not really, because partly because you don't necessarily have that kind of a differentiation at this juncture, okay? The main sort of danger, as it were, actually was within themselves in terms of their political competition that they had within this particular cultural zone, okay? Well, let's move on to the next slide then. I know there's a question that just showed up. Were these cities more agriculturally based or hunting based? In reality, if you have a city of this scale, either the city of Changzhou in 1600 BC or the city of Yin in 1200 BC, the only way you could sustain such large-scale urban centers is actually through agriculture. All right, animal husbandry will not provide you with the economic resources that are necessary to support such a huge population base. So agriculture is the key. It's not just the agricultural production lands around the city, although those are absolutely important, but also the ability to bring in the economic produce, right, of other cities that are now under your your subject authority.
Especially considering since NC in 180 capitals. So
yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, that is a possibility. Yeah. Okay, so the implications of the late Shang period, at least in North China, by the end of the second millennium BC, we've talked about a little bit as we looked at the map. So I'll just reiterate: one, no need for demarcation features or strong defenses, because the core is very strong and probably has exerted control across a fairly large region, right, by about 1300 BC. Importantly, I think it just indicates that the social or the political elite have become very well established, right? From 1600 BC to 1300 BC, that 300-year period allowed for the political elite to reinforce their hold, right, on society and across a much larger landscape than they did before at the beginning of the second millennium BC. The third thing, of course, is how do you exert control, okay, over society? And I think here, and we'll look at it in the next couple of slides, is where the role of ritual and the afterlife becomes absolutely important as a means of exerting social control over large populations and over large groups, over a large geographical landscape. And you actually have the sense of the development, like the rubric of a strong central authority. So some kind of governmental system that's developing here already, right? That's not just based in that urban center, but also spreads out to all the other urban centers across this particular sort of cultural zone, okay? Even though, in principle, we are not really seeing any bureaucratic system developing, right? It looks like there is a system, but we can't kind of put our finger on it, partly because there is almost no textual evidence for it. But one does suspect that it exists, because how can you have these hierarchies of cities and societies and so on and so forth without some kind of a structure in place, right? Okay, or at least some kind of a social understanding of the system that would be in place that allows for that hierarchy at a macro level to develop. Okay, so some things to think about. And I like to indicate at this juncture that a lot of what we talk about are sort of probable postulations. In other words, it is likely that that was what happened, okay? It is not certain that that was definitely what happened, right? Because we don't have the, hard confirmatory evidence, right, for that, right? We're reconstructing based on whatever materials and data is available, right? And we think this is what it is, okay? And it's a really good intelligent guess, right? It kind of keeps being reinforced over time with more information and data and more excavations that were excavated and so on and so forth. But we still don't have the definitive, this is really what it is, okay? So I think it's very important as we think about early history that this is what we bear in mind, the challenges of historiography, okay? This is something that's a real thing. Yeah.
Is this during the time of like early folk religions? I know Confucius wasn't around around yet.
Mhm.
But once it's
No,
announced-
and Confucius will not show up on the scene for at least another 800 years, right, from 1300 BC. So what we're looking at here is a much more elaborate articulation of the animist rituals and the zoomorphic, sort of polymorph things that we were looking at in the Neolithic era, right? That single plane of existence where you have the spirit beings and the spirit realm that exists in correlation with the natural world, right? And the natural beings and so on and so forth,
So
okay?
kind of like a folk religion.
Yeah, it really is, the best way of thinking about it is animism. And animism really is, there's spirits everywhere. Everything could possibly be a spirit, right? There's a tree, like animal, or, like a rock. I mean, a mountain, for example, right? And anything, okay? And it's how you interact with that spirit realm, right? And some of the things that you would do as rituals in order to appease, to invoke, and so on and so forth, right? So animism, I think, is probably one of the best ways of thinking about it. And this is what we're looking at in a very complex manner. Yeah.
This might be a stupid question. I can't really differentiate them.
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of what Taoism is derived from? Does anything have a spirit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If we think about it, and by the way, for those of you online, the question was, is Taoism probably the closest to what we're looking at here in terms of maybe a continuity of some sort, right?
Idea that
Yeah.
everything has a spirit.
And the answer is yes. Taoism is the closest that we probably will be able to get to this, right? As a line of continuity in terms of beliefs and spiritual issues in the Chinese cultural context. So that's a really, really good observation. Okay. One of the big things that occurs as a major difference in the city of Yin, which you don't find in the city of Zhangzhou from 1600 BC, are the burial complexes. Okay, and that is one of the biggest differentiations in terms of the social dynamics and the nature of society as we look at an urban settlement pattern. Okay, let me back up a little bit. So Xipeigang is this small little area here, not horrendously huge, roughly about, I think, just under half a mile across, all right, by about maybe a third or a quarter of a mile wide, okay? But when you zoom in, this is what you see, okay? Essentially, what we're looking at is a series of tombs that are really quite big, okay? And they all only bury one individual in there, right? Now, you might have some human sacrifices in there, but then they weren't a lot, like maybe just one or two people in there that were sort of sacrificed along with the interment of whoever was deceased, okay, whoever was dead, all right? But each of these burial plots really only contained one major body person in there, all right? But this is what we want to see, right? So one is the scale of the construction of these tombs, all right? They're really, really very big and quite deep. The other thing is this. Does anybody know what this is? What are all of these things here?
Are they like grave goods?
Are they locations of grave goods that accompany the much bigger burial pit? Possibly. Okay. What else? What else? Are they headstones? No, they're not headstones. Somebody said graves. That's a possibility that there might be dead bodies there. What else? Are they grave markers? On the landscape itself, before the excavation occurred, right, the archaeological excavation occurred, there was no indication that there were things underneath. Let's just put it that way. Okay. What else? Collapsed passages. Good try. No. All right. What else? What are some of the characteristics of how these things are laid out? Yeah, it's really orderly, right? They all are in rows. They have some kind of a very clear spatial logic to them, right? So in other words, this is what? It's actually intentional, okay? If this was like kind of a burial pit, you would probably find a larger square like this, and then a lot of skeletons are in there, right? So this, like, if we wanted to dispose of bodies, because they work themselves to death, for example, digging this big big cross here, right? You would just throw them into a large pit and then you just cover it, and that would have been the end of it. Okay, so this was a very intentional thing that was going on. All right, very orderly. It was already planned. Just so you know, every one of those.
Maybe it's for like families, like family burials.
The possibility that we might be looking at families that might be interned in here. Yeah, that is that's a possibility. Although what was happening there was individuals that were basically being interned.
So is it like individual tombs? And you guys talked earlier about how like religion and stuff was used as a means of like political authority. So by like respecting the dead and stuff, is that why it got more orderly?
Yeah. So to kill everybody's suspense, basically what was happening here were 2,000 bodies that were buried in individual graves that accompanied this large tomb burial that was occurring. Okay. Now, can you remember last week when we were looking at Neolithic tombs and we saw the one with the shells and a couple of bodies with the triangle kind of like layout? Remember that? Yeah. There were only 4 bodies in that grave, right? Okay. So 1,000 years ago, when a king died, you had 3 or 4 sacrificial humans that were interned in the grave. Fast forward 1,000 years, and what we're seeing here is that for a prince to be interned, you actually had what? Like 2,000 people would be killed to accompany the internment of this person who was basically, had passed away. Okay? I don't know about you, but the scale at which social control had occurred over that 1 millennia was extremely substantial. Okay, to imagine that you could sacrifice 2,000 humans at a point where a social elite would pass away so that they could, sort of go into the spiritual realm, accompanied by this huge entourage, I think is a phenomenal statement of the fact that the political elite were really able to control this mass scale population that was being sort of, developed over time, right, by about 1,200 BC. Yeah.
I know this is a little bit ahead, but with the Qin dynasty and how the emperor actually buried himself with the terracotta armies like that, could that kind of be related to how, because I know he did that so he was protected in the spiritual realm.
Yeah.
Is that kind of like what's here, except he used clay instead of people?
So the question was, as we fast forward another 1,000 years to about maybe 213 BC, at the death of the first emperor of the Qin dynasty, right, which unified the whole of China. The terracotta armies, for example, Shanxi is then an example of a similar effort, basically, right, to have this huge entourage and this big army accompanying you going into your the spirit world. The answer is yes. Except that by 200 BC, it was no longer acceptable to just massacre 10,000 people, all right? Because the state was the be-all, and also the emperor was supposed to be the person that managed the state for the benefit of people and society. So the philosophical articulation had changed. But at this juncture, it really just is about the ability to exploit society for the social elite's benefit. So it's the same idea, except that, hey, why do you need to make 10,000 or 2,000 clay humans when you can just readily sacrifice 2,000 humans, right? Like real humans in order to do that, okay? So that's really what we're looking at here, okay? The cities, the burials are very, very, they're not really very complex. But in terms of the scale of what was needed to be done was pretty large. So if you look at that, that's kind of a really, really big pit. This is a picture of one of the excavations just to have a sense of what the scale is. This is a guy. Let me just see if I can go back there. Here we go. Right. So it gives you a sense of the scale. All right. So let me just show this last slide and we can continue the rest of this next week where we when we have the class lecture. So as a last slide, this is a cross-section of one of the tombs dated to 1200 BC. This is an important lady. She was a royal consort, but obviously she was not like a ruler, right? Okay, and this is a cross-section of the pit, and this is what this part looks like in terms of a plain view, and this is what the internal tomb looks like. I don't want to rush through this because there's quite a bit of information that I need to talk about in here, so I'll leave that to the next class lecture.